So I was watching a very interesting documentary last night. It was from the series Timeline, and it was about the Great Plague of London of 1665. This is a subject I was interested in before coronavirus because plagues actually have a very, very important socio-political, um, not just plagues, other epidemics have an important socio-political influence on the histories of cities and countries. Most great European cities have seen plagues at some point in their history. In antiquity, there was the Great Plague of Athens, devastating. And in the early modern period, London, of course, Seville and Milan also saw very severe plague outbreaks, as did Vienna, and I'm sure all the great European cities did. It's interesting that the London outbreak is so famous. If you look, for example, if you Google something generic like Great Plague um, into YouTube, almost all the documentaries are about the London case. But actually, the Great Plague of Milan, which occurred from 1629 to 1631, was even more deadly. That left between 500,000 and 1 million people dead in Milan and around the Lombardy region. The Great Plague of Seville, 1647 to 1652, again could have been up to 500,000 dead. The London Plague of 1665, so we're talking about 20 years after the Great Plague of Seville, left around, well, that's where it actually gets interesting. The upper figures go up to around 150,000, which is still a staggering proportion. But it was a very well made documentary. And I'll come in a little bit to the actual mortality rate. But what the documentary looked at was how, in the early modern period, in the 17th century, there was this millennial mindset among people. That is to say, that every misfortune, every disaster, everything was seen as a sort of millennial type event, an end of world type event. So the 17th century was pretty turbulent in Britain. We had, of course, the British Civil Wars. We had the regicide of King Charles I. There was a lot of very pivotal events around that period. And of course, these were made famous by Samuel Pepys. The thing is, Pepys was absolutely part of the elite, and he was quite a frightful snob. If you look at his diaries, he's quite a controversial figure. Nevertheless, his diaries are a very valuable tool. But he didn't get into the day-to-day life of ordinary Londoners so much as the sort of people that he liaised with, high-level merchants and politicians and so on. But the documentary really explored that other side of life at the time. And if you look at the official response, it's pretty appalling. Basically, their attitude was to relocate the House of Lords to, I believe it was Oxford, and basically just hope that it would pass. They basically didn't care about the poor. Um, red crosses would be painted on the doors. People would be quarantined. This happened in other cities as well. Of course, in Edinburgh, there's the famous Mary King's Close. Um, and like I say, a lot of this tied in with this millennial thinking. People were intensely religious. So every sort of misfortune was seen as punishment from God for saying a bad word to your husband or for um, maybe feeling an impure thought or whatever it might be. Among the remedies, for example, that was used was the moss from a dead man's skull was thought to be able to cure sexually transmitted diseases. This was the sort of things that was going on. Needless to say, sanitation was filthy. There was no pavements, no flushing toilets, or, well, there were none, certainly among the populace. The Mayor of London, the Lord Mayor of London, devised this kind of cage type thing because he thought that would protect him. I think he did survive, but it was utterly devastating. So if we even look at the lower figure, which was 67,000 from the bills of mortality, that still represents an enormous proportion when you consider the London population at the time, that is the City of London and its environs, was about 400 to 500,000. Um, a lot smaller than today. That would be the equivalent of maybe the city of Bristol today. So certainly a big city by 17th century standards, but a lot smaller than today. But that proportion is truly staggering. Now, the true figure is going to be a lot higher. The reason being is that the data was collected by the church, so they didn't take into account Jewish deaths, they didn't take into account nonconformist deaths, so Quakers, um, early Methodists, those sort of people were simply not registered. And many of the poor didn't report deaths in their family from the fear that they would be hauled up, basically. Um, I mean, we're in lockdown today, but we're allowed out for food and exercise. This really meant you were locked up, you were a prisoner, basically. And it didn't matter if your family member was dying, well, you're going to live there with them and you'll probably die as well. And they used this kind of prototype street, which was Cock and Key Lane in the City of London. As an example, um, some 36 people died in that street. Of the 20 households, 11 of them were affected. So these sort of proportions were astonishing. The true figure, and therefore in London, when you include all the people who weren't registered, could well be well in excess of 100,000 deaths. That's by far London's worst disaster. It's worse than the death toll from the Blitz. It's worse even than the medieval plague in de facto terms. Now, the proportion of the medieval plague, and this is something that actually needs to be understood. In fact, I need to check my dinner. I hope it's not burning. I'll just talk as I'm moving. The medieval Black Death um, of 1347 to 1352 probably killed fewer people overall, but just make sure this isn't burning. We're okay. Um, this term, Black Death, in fact, I'll just washing machine's also on. Excuse me. So, Black Death actually doesn't refer to a single event. It could be the generic term for the Second Great Plague outbreak. The first being in the 6th century, the Great Plague of Justinian. The Black Death refers to a period of actually a few centuries. So it's not referring just to that medieval outbreak, because the Yersinia pestis strain of 1665 was basically the same strain, bubonic plague, of the 1347 outbreak. That 1347 to 1352 outbreak was the deadliest single event in human history, even deadlier than the 1918 influenza pandemic, deadlier than any war. It was absolutely hellish. Um, it's thought around 25 million people died in Europe alone. The worldwide total could have been as high as 100 million. So it was utterly, utterly devastating. Um, and the 1665 plague was basically the same strain. Now, whilst people were intensely religious, and it's easy to scoff at them as being religious fanatics, I think we do. I think it would be a mistake to sort of think they were all idiots. There were intelligent, educated people around who understood that certainly they wouldn't have understood the science that we know today. They didn't have microscopes, they didn't have um, an understanding of how viruses work. But they had a degree of common sense. They understood, for example, the necessity of quarantine. They understood the necessity of cutting off travel. So they weren't complete idiots, and there were intelligent people around. I think sometimes we make the mistake of kind of looking down at the past and say, oh, they were all just primitive idiots. But they could only work with what they knew. And within that, you had more educated people. So that particular plague epidemic of 1665, we don't know the precise starting point. The first deaths were only being recorded in about April 1665, but the outbreak could have begun as early as December 1664. By 1666, it had effectively vanished. There's a popular anecdote that the Great Fire of London likely wiped it out, and that's probably true. There were probably other factors that wiped it out, but certainly the Great Fire of London would have been a big one, a good example of a bad event kind of having some good consequences, a bit like today's COVID-19 has had a good effect for the environment, at least temporarily. Um, So it was the single deadliest event in London's history. Now, the medieval plague, I've seen two different figures for that, 62,000, which to me, even allowing for the sheer mortality of that period, London's population then was around 50,000. So that seems questionable. Even if we say it's 100,000, 62,000 is two-thirds. I think a figure maybe more around 30,000 is more plausible. However, the ratio was absolutely intense. London recorded other severe plagues in the following years: 1563, 1593, 1603, 1625, and 1636. The 1625 plague outbreak, as an example, cost 41,000 lives. You know, these were devastating pandemics. It often meant a great disruption to social life, much as we're seeing today. So theatres closed back then. Today, we see cinemas closed. Um, so in some ways, in 350 years, not that much has changed. Pandemics are still deadly killers. Having said that, you know, we're thinking today that around 2,500 people may have died from COVID-19 in London. London has close to 9 million people. So as a proportion, we have to bear in mind that coronavirus is still a very, very, very small proportion of the population has actually died from this compared to previous plague pandemics. So that's why I do think it's important to keep that in mind, if for no other reason than for people's mental health, not to get depressed thinking about how awful it is for all the people who are dying. Certainly, the health service has taken a real blow from this. A lot of doctors and nurses and other medical personnel have died, and I support these calls to give them some sort of special award after all of this, really to recognise what they have went through, something equivalent to what veterans get when they do a tour of duty. I really think that we need to recognise medical staff in a similar way. Um, so anyway, I just thought that was interesting to look at. London, like I say, is by no means the only city that has been through devastating plague. Italy has always been a country that has been hard hit by pandemics, in part because it's a peninsula, it's a trading nation, uh, Britain's a trading island, but Italy in particular, in some ways, is the heart of Europe, because whenever there was trade in Europe from North Africa, from the Middle East, it was the Italian ports particularly that handled it. That's why Italy has always been hard hit by plague pandemics, more so than other European countries. Um, but this is truly a worldwide phenomenon. In Latin America, we saw some devastating outbreaks, not necessarily bubonic plague. There were other diseases that, for example, certainly brought by Europeans going to the New World. But even earlier than that, there was one in the Mayan civilization. It's not entirely understood what it was, but it may have killed up 500,000 people even before Europeans arrived. So it's an interesting thing. But London is really a city that's been through some devastating events. Paris certainly has as well. Milan, Seville, Vienna, Athens, Rome, all the great European cities have had their outbreaks. But that London plague of 1665 might well be the most documented. So I'll put a link to this documentary, and it's very interesting stuff. I think it's very well made. It was uploaded in 2017, but I don't know when it was made. Check it out.